you so much for having me here, and special thank you to Cameron and the entire organizing committee of EDGY for everything that you have done to put on this conference together, and for all of you for coming here and fighting LA traffic, which I'm learning is a thing, that is a big thing. All right, so there's some slides. Where's Paul? Hi, Paul. All right, so I'm gonna gesture to Paul when I need things to change. We're gonna rock this out. So I wanna start today, beyond thanking all of you for being here, by acknowledging that this is a moment in our country that's not a pretty one. It's not where most of us thought we were going to be, if you asked us a year ago. And that's a nice way of saying that things are really scary for many people, but especially for queer folks and trans folks and people of color and immigrants and anyone who is anything except for heteronormative, straight, cis, white, Christian. This is a frightening time, and it's also an exceptionally important moment within our queer community, and I'm so glad to be here with all of you today. When I was first approached about coming to speak here at EDGY, I loved that the theme for this year's conference was embracing identities. Because I think that one of the most important things that we can do as queer people in the face of a government who hates us and a mainstream culture that says we shouldn't exist and shouldn't have the kinds of lives or bodies or families that we do is live out and proud and embrace and celebrate and cherish who we are so that we can inspire others to do the same and pave the way for it to be safe for them to do that. So, who am I? I've lived a lot of really queer lives. I'm a formerly homeless youth, I'm a genderqueer person, I'm a leather dyke, I'm a runaway, and I've successfully had a successful career in LGBTQ nonprofit management for the last decade, including being the director of an LGBTQ youth homeless drop-in program in New York City. I'm an author and an advocate. I've written 3 award-winning novels and edited 2 anthologies, including Kicked Out, which was the first anthology of its kind that brought together the voices of current and former homeless LGBTQ youth. So I write queer books for queer readers. If you haven't guessed, I'm a really big believer in identity politics. I believe that not only is the personal political, thank you feminism, but I believe the personal is also professional, which I think is what I'm supposed to talk to you guys about today. All right. 16 years ago, I ran away from home. On September 9th, 2001, I was 17 years old, and I left my mother's house on a Sunday morning, and I never went back, and I never saw her again. Running away set into motion a life and career that has been fundamentally rooted in the idea that I was going to center queerness in everything that I do. Queerness was and is, in many ways, the most important thing to me. It's the basis of my politics, my ethics, the way that I build and define family. I ran away to survive and escape, and I ran away to embrace queerness, and it was because of queer culture and community that I was able to not only survive, but thrive. So LGBTQ youth are significantly overrepresented within populations of youth experiencing homelessness. There's an estimated 1.6 to 2.8 million homeless youth in the United States, and 40% of those homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. 16 years ago, I thought I was the only gay kid who left home. I had no idea that I was part of what is literally an epidemic in our country, and yet it is homeless youth, and specifically, predominantly homeless youth of color, who fought back against the police at Stonewall. They birthed our revolution, and in many instances, we've left their descendants quite literally out in the cold. LGBTQ homeless youth, or youth homelessness, impacts every community, regardless of race, class, religion, and geographic region. The night I ran away from my mom's house, the adult friends who agreed to let me stay with them asked if I was over that whole gay thing. And I went back in the closet. At the same time, I was helping to start my school's first GSA. 6 months later, those same adults read my journal and kicked me out of their house, and my semi-rural, semi-suburban high school told me they'd never had to deal with a homeless teenager before. They told me they didn't know what to do. The victim's advocate, who the court appointed to me after my mother pled guilty to felony assault of a minor, said that I should forget the gay thing and go home. She said I had a mother who loved me and that I should be normal. She didn't understand that leaving had been my one chance at survival. So I used the police to run away because I knew that if I went on my own, my mother would hunt me down and I would never have a chance to run again. I spent hours at the police station, the whir of the Polaroid camera documenting the bruises I'd become an expert at hiding since kindergarten. I just want to pause again and say that I used the police to run away because I knew that as a white kid in suburbia that I had a lot of privilege to believe that the police might help me. I grew up in semi-rural Oregon, and where I come from, kids don't get kicked out. There aren't programs or systems or shelters. Where I come from, we're supposed to keep our family secrets. When I stopped crashing at my friend's house and went to the city, the courts just told me not to get in trouble in the remaining few months before I turned 18. I was a minor living on my own. My white skin privilege, class, and good grades protected me. But still, survival became dependent upon being invisible. Whenever I'm invited to speak at conferences like this, my mind wanders to memories of the first conference I ever attended, the NIAC, National Youth Advocacy Coalition's National LGBTQ Youth Conference in Washington, D.C. It was 2002, the week after I turned 18, which for a teenage runaway is a really big birthday. It means that no adult, no social worker or judge or cop, and yes, to runaways, all those professions can kind of be the same, could ever make you go home. So I flew cross country by myself. I stayed in a hotel room. I ate fast food for every meal. I had a lot of sex, and I met a lot of really amazing queer youth organizers from around the country. I was presenting on a panel about non-tokenizing ways to incorporate LGBTQ youth into leadership positions, into community organizing. I was the only youth on that panel. Let me repeat. I was co-leading a workshop on non-tokenizing strategies for including LGBTQ youth voices into organizations, and I was the only youth on a panel with 5 or 6 adults. So that experience cemented that I wanted to do queer organizing, but it also had a huge influence on the way I understood queer organizations and the kind of work that I wanted to be part of as a youth organizer, and influenced the kind of work I wanted to go on to do in adulthood. So back in Portland, the youth who took me in had founded a queer youth drop-in center. It and the punk houses we slept in were our collective sanctuaries. They were our sites of protest, gatherings, open mic readings, publishing houses. They were also the places where we built family. None of us had a relationship with the people that raised us. We revolted against their homophobic, transphobic, racist, abusive, violent communities that bore us and renamed ourselves, rebirthed ourselves into a gritty queer world. I feel really grateful that as a homeless queer teen, I came of age at the tail end of a generation of American queer folks who had no expectation that our government would respect us, understand us, or even see us as human. Growing up with this understanding of queerness made me seek safety and community amongst other queers, and it influenced the decisions I continue to make as a queer adult, from how I built home and chosen family to how I supervise my staff at my nonprofit job to the books I write. As a former runaway, my story is not unique. Everywhere I go, I meet folks who have had similar experiences to me. We're the children of dysfunction, the product of families that don't want us, but we build our own queer families, generation after queer generation. I feel a lot of kinship to EDGY's theme this year because I'm a firm believer that until we can embrace our identities, all of them, and live fully in ourselves, we can't possibly support youth in doing the same. One of the repeating themes of my work has been thinking about and prioritizing visibility and representation for queer youth, and particularly for homeless youth. When you don't see representations of yourself, it's really hard to live authentically and fully. So the first representation of homeless youth I ever saw came from a very unlikely place, and it was highly imperfect and a little cringeworthy. Okay, really cringeworthy. So in 1997, the show Touched by an Angel aired an episode called Children of the Night. Okay. I was 12 years old, and every Sunday I watched this show because in its imperfect way, it made me feel safe. I remember being obsessed with the homeless kid episode from the preview the week before. I lived a very controlled life. I never thought running away was something that really happened. So I recorded this episode of Touched by an Angel on my family's VCR, probably over a home video or a football game. And I watched it alone in the family room while my mom was drinking in the next room. And I remember watching that episode and having the idea that someday I was going to run away. It wasn't that this show glorified runaways or life on the streets, quite the contrary. What mattered about this episode was that it gave me the idea that I wasn't alone, that I wouldn't be alone, and that there were other kids like me who had problems that couldn't be fixed in the homes we grew up in. So I rewatched this episode recently, thanks YouTube, and I was surprised actually by how right they got some things, even more right than some homeless youth providers today. So there was no question that these homeless kids were a family, and that street families and chosen families is real family. Early in the episode, Monica, who is one of the angels, asks the older angel, Tess, if her job is to get these kids back home, to which the older and more experienced angel responds, "Oh no, that's how the world has failed them so far. They just want to get rid of them and send them back where they came from. We've got to do better than that. We've got to give them what they need, not what we think they need." Harm reduction, trauma-informed, youth-centered work right there on network TV in the mid-90s. We can do this. Granted, it was delivered by an angel, but these aren't new ideas, okay? And they're still hard for youth workers to enact today. Okay, slide. Okay, not look at 90s TV anymore. So every night after that episode aired, I dreamed about running away and living with other queer kids. I know how this sounds. It wasn't that this show romanticized the life of runaways. I mean, over the course of a 45-minute episode, multiple kids died and one contracted TB. And like now as an advocate and a service provider, I can totally see the flaws in this representation. And yet, I can't deny the fire that it started in me and the seed it planted, that there were kids who could build family together, families that could protect them when adults couldn't or wouldn't. 5 years after that episode of Touched by an Angel aired, for the first time, I ran away. At 17, the day after I became homeless, I went to my county library because books had never failed me before. So I searched the card catalog, and I couldn't find anything there, though, that spoke to my experience as a queer runaway. As a homeless youth couch surfing with friends from my GSA. That day at the library, I promised myself that if I survived, I would write books so that no other queer kid would feel as alone as I felt. That dream kept me company on lonely nights, on borrowed couches, and guided me to find other queers who were committed to making the world a better and safer place for us all. I kept that promise, though age had taught me the naivety of the idea that I could ever write enough books to save all the youth who would come after me. So at 17, I went looking for stories of kids like me, and I couldn't find any at the library. So then years later, I made it. My first book was titled Kicked Out, and it was a collection, an anthology of current and former homeless LGBTQ youth from around the country, ranging in age from youth who were street homeless when we went to press, to the oldest contributor who had come out pre-Stonewall. Representation matters. On October 11th, 1998, a year after that Touched by an Angel episode aired, I saw my first gay person on TV. 19 years ago this month, Matthew Shepard was murdered. When I saw the coverage of his death in that Wyoming fence on the TV news, my mother said he was asking for it. His mother, Judy Shepard, would 10 years later write the foreword to my Kicked Out anthology. Slide. One of my favorite stories in Kicked Out was written by a young woman named Eternity, spelled with an exclamation point. She had just aged out of youth shelter and was back to couch surfing and street homelessness. Eternity submitted her story to Kicked Out on the day the call for submissions closed. Eternity told her story using the only medium she had available to her cell phone. And I don't mean a fancy smartphone with a keyboard. This was like almost 10 years ago. She was using a phone where you had to hit the number 3 times, sometimes to get to the letter you wanted. So Eternity wrote 37 text messages using a combination of text speak and street slang to tell her story, and she sent them to a staff member at the shelter she just aged out from. And that staff member typed up all 37 text messages and emailed them to me. Her story was published just as she wrote it, with a translation into traditional English for those who needed it underneath. Creating space for youth to tell their stories means empowering them to do so in their own way, in their own languages. We need to listen to youth about what their life is like right now and what they want for their future, instead of silencing their voices with our reassurance that it will get better someday, or pretending that our version of success is the same as their vision. There's this great moment in the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out. I'm gonna slide. Yep. Which all takes place inside the head of an 11-year-old girl named Riley, where all of her feelings are characters in the film, helping her grapple with the stress of her family having moved from Minnesota to San Francisco. And the protagonist, Joy, who is at times cruel in her attempt at enforcing compulsive happiness, gets stuck in long-term memory, along with the character of Sadness, who she bullies for the first part of the movie. And they're stuck outside of headquarters, which is the part of the brain where these emotion characters control Riley's moods. And so without Joy in headquarters, it is impossible for Riley to be happy. And while Joy and Sadness are lost together in the far recesses of Riley's mind, Riley can only be angry, afraid, and disgusted, which are the remaining characters at headquarters, feelings. Meanwhile, Joy and Sadness are lost in long-term memory, attempting to get back to headquarters, and they meet Bing Bong, Riley's forgotten imaginary friend. The character of Bing Bong is part cat, part elephant, part dolphin, part cotton candy, part 1920s homeless hobo. I added that last part. So at a key moment in the film, the character of Sadness sits with Bing Bong in his grief, instead of simply trying to gloss over it and cheer him up, like the character of Joy had been doing. I think pop culture can teach youth workers a lot about how to do this work. How to sit with our runaway or most traumatized youth in a moment of sadness and knowing that it doesn't always get better. The idea of family is a weapon that has been used against so many of us to varying degrees, and in many cases it's also been taken violently from us. The idea of family has become a battleground. It's become politicized and privileged, and all too often, it's the most marginalized who get trapped in the crossfire. The idea of family being something that needs to be defined is a rhetoric, or defended rather, is a rhetoric that religious leaders preaching and legislating around a narrow definition of what they consider to not be family. But it isn't just the right wing who are set on defining family in narrow ways. Increasingly, we also need to take the idea of family back from social service providers who sleep better at night when we can pretend that youth are safer because we've sent them home. Thank you. I agree. To be with families that raised them, I believe that one of the most dangerous things we can do as LGBTQ service providers is to promote the idea of family reunification. If young people who have run away or been kicked out want to rebuild relationships with their biological families, fantastic. Then please put all of your organizational resources you have behind them doing that work. But if the youth in your programs are anything like the youth I've known, built family with, worked alongside, and Ben, who predominantly know that they ran away for valid reasons, one of the most alienating things that you can do to that young person is to push them to reunify with their abusers. Family is not about government approval or recognition. It's not found on a piece of paper. Queer culture has always known this, and we can't allow the social and legal advancements we've earned in recent years to nullify the legacy of queer kinship networks. How the formation of chosen families has queerly supported the survival of LGBTQ movements. Family is a stitching together of lives, a bond that I believe is strongest when it's claimed, not prescribed by blood or government. So I know that family reunification is seen by some as a leading best practice in queer youth work, and I've read the limited studies, and I understand the arguments about negative health outcomes for youth who don't reunify. But here's the thing. I believe those researchers have missed. They're right that family is important for the survival of queer youth, but they're wrong in arguing that it should be biological families. So many of these public health studies are rooted in the baseline assumption that the family of origin is a safe place to be. But what happens if it isn't? And what happens if it never was? Thanks. When we push past reunification, when we say that as adults we know better than youth what is best for them now and how their theoretical future health outcomes, we alienate them and we risk losing connection to them altogether. So I already told you about how I ran away from home using the police when I was 17 years old, and then a few months later, the adult friends I was staying with read my diary and discovered that I was still really gay, and they kicked me out of their house. So they called my high school and had me paged to the office because this was before cell phones, and they told me not to come home, not that night, not ever. That first night, I didn't know where I was going to go. I remember my school had already told me they didn't have any supports for me. So that night, I asked to stay with one of my friends, and he called his mom at work, and she said yes, even though she was a conservative Christian, and she wasn't comfortable with co-ed slumber parties. And she was also really in denial that her son was gay. And so I went to their house after school, and I was in shock. I was trying to figure out what was going to happen to me. And this was before I'd gone to that queer youth resource center, and this was before I'd ever met another homeless kid beyond those fictionalized portrayals on TV years before that were really bad. And so my friend sat next to me on his living room couch, and he said it was time to grow up. He said that 17-year-olds did not make it on their own. Forgetting all the nights he had spent on the phone with me before I ran away, he said things with my mom couldn't have been that bad. He said I should consider going home. And then his mom came home from work and she said the same thing. So I panicked. I remember saying that I needed time to think. I remember crying. I just needed someone to tell me that this was possible, that survival was possible. So I picked up their phone and called the school. I asked to talk to my favorite teacher, the one who everyone knew was a dyke, but had been told by the administration that she could be fired if she came out. So I remember her classroom phone ringing, and I remember praying that she hadn't gone home yet, and then she picked up. I told her I couldn't stay with this friend, and that he said I'd been wrong to run away and to stay away and that I should go home. I told her I was prepared to sleep on the streets of our rural county that night. My closeted teacher took down the phone number for where I was. She told me not to go anywhere. She broke some rules. She called the mom of my other best friend. He was gay. His older sister, who was away at college, was gay. His parents were hippies. And within 20 minutes, his mom came and picked me up, and I spent the night at their house, and I spent the next couple of months at their house. If his mom had told me to go home, I would have left their house, and I don't know what would have happened to me. I'm forever grateful for their willingness to take me in, never having met me, and let me live on their couch and in their spare bedroom. But not only that, also that they understood they could give me a safe place to be, but that I needed community and culture to figure out how to grow myself into a queer adult. It was with their support and the support of my closeted teacher that I took the bus to downtown Portland to SMIRC, the Sexual Minority Youth Recreation Center, where I found other queer youth who had experiences similar to mine. The staff who supported us, the staff who supported us in building community together. If I'd walked into that queer youth center for the first time and the staff there told me to reunify with my mother, if they hadn't supported me as a runaway, if they hadn't told me how brave I was or introduced me to others who had escaped, if chosen family, gay family, street family hadn't been normalized, if the idea of queer folks who were going to do things different hadn't been celebrated, I would have walked out the door and never gone back. And I don't know where I'd be today, but I can guarantee it wouldn't be standing here talking to you. I share this to highlight the ways in which, if we lead conversations with runaway LGBTQ youth from the perspective that reconnecting with family of origin is important or the priority, we run the real risk of alienating the most marginalized youth we're working with. It's not the job of LGBTQ youth to make or even be present for making their families of origin less homophobic or transphobic. So on a parallel level, white America is grappling with a legacy of racism in our country, and lots of white people are asking people of color how to be less racist, and being rightly told it's not their job. It is never the responsibility of the oppressed to educate the oppressor. It is not the responsibility of queer youth to educate their homophobic, transphobic families of origin. Thank you. It is not the job of youth to put themselves in physical or psychological harm in an attempt to educate those families. It is okay for youth to say no more and to want to create their own families built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared identity, and acceptance. There are youth who will reunify with their families of origin, and there are youth who won't. The choice has to be theirs, but believe me when I say the reunification message is one we get loud and clear from strangers and Hallmark cards and television commercials. We're about to start getting them in like 3 weeks all the time. They are all telling us clearly that birth family is the most important thing and we should all be home for the holidays and etc. Our queer service providers need to give us different messages. There are things that queer youth need that their heterosexual, cisgender families of origin can't give them. The studies that push towards reunification are overwhelmingly happening without the input of youth who have left home and are pushing this heteronormative and increasingly homonormative definition of family instead of celebrating the rainbow of ways that queer people have always built and maintained family and kinship structures to care for each other. Also, please, as like a personal favor to me, even though you don't really know me, please do not under any circumstances use the term fictive kin, even if it's just in your board report or your policy white paper. Queer family, chosen family, street family are real. And for many of us, they are the realest family we've ever had. Quote, "Don't they know I would be dead without my chosen family?" A runaway kicked out community member recently wrote on my Facebook in response to an article that was published speaking negatively to homeless youth service providers about the role of chosen and street family in the lives of their clients. As a community and service providers, we need to celebrate, support, and continue to develop queer, chosen kinship networks and families. Queer youth deserve the kind of family that cherish and honor them, and agencies must respect the way you, as the youth we work with, define family. As another follower on social media recently said on my wall, "Don't those providers understand blood isn't thicker?" Slide. There is a beautifully, highly underappreciated picture book by the late, great, and gay Maurice Sendak. It's called We Were All in the Dumps with Jack and Guy, and it's all about homeless children on the streets where the houses are built without walls, end quote. The book explores the awful ways that systems and adults fail homeless kids again and again and again. When even the moon is out to get them, they find that the moral of the story is that these homeless youth, Jack and Guy, form a family. And they find a younger kid with one black eye who is starving, bitten by the rat, pursued by adults with ill intent. And they pool their resources, buy some bread, come together in community, and they bring up the younger kid, quote, as other folk do. When I was 17 and growing up in a queer youth program in Portland, Oregon, I idolized the staff. So this queer youth center was the first time in my entire life where I felt like I belonged, where I had friends that I could really relate to, and I lived for the hours that I could go to drop in and the relationships I built there. But I also, in my early days in that space, felt inspired and called and driven to build that world for the youth who would come after me. I remember saying to myself and my peers and the staff, when I grow up, I'm gonna be a program director. When I grow up, I wanna run a community center just like this. 16 years later, my day job is as the director of one of the largest LGBTQ youth drop-in programs in New York City. This job is in so many ways exactly, we'll see. Thanks. It's in so many ways exactly what I set out to do as a homeless queer teen, and in other ways, a heartbreaking reality constrained by bureaucracy and incapable of living up to the vision I had all those years ago for what this work would be like. I think a lot about what feels different about this work than the ongoing artistic partnerships I've had with homeless youth through the years via the creation of my Kicked Out anthology and as a writing instructor. I also think a lot about the ways in which nonprofits, and specifically large LGBTQ nonprofits, have professionalized amidst the rise of nonprofit culture of people coming into this work for career advancement reasons, not because their heart's in it, or these are the communities they call home. So as a queer service provider, talking to direct service providers today, I thought a lot about what I could say that would be inspiring, especially at a conference like this, and I'm not sure how I know quite how to do that. So I'd like everyone over the age of 25 to raise your hands. Okay, me too, right? Okay, there's a lot of us. Here's the thing, and this might upset you, and I'm gonna say it anyway because I'm up here so I get to do that. We don't know how to create programs for youth. I, as a 33-year-old, really queer person, do not know how to create programs for youth anymore. Coming to terms with this has been one of the most professionally painful experiences of my career. Yes, of course, I'm still skilled at all the administrative things that led me to programmatic leadership positions, but I can't tell you what it is that youth of today need in their programs, and here's why. I'm not a youth. It's like that moment in Peter Pan where he comes back for Wendy and she's all grown up and the magic is gone and she can't fly away with him. She had chosen to grow up, and so did I. I aged myself out of being a youth at 19, and then when I graduated from college, I moved to New York City and immediately got hired to work in queer nonprofits. When I was hired to start and run a homeless youth drop-in program at a well-established, very large agency, I was the same age as my oldest clients. A secret HR made sure to warn me not to share. While much of my life, education, access, socioeconomic class, and frequently race were very different from the youth I would work with, we also had many things in common. It was a strength I was able to leverage to work with those young people to build programs that met their needs and their goals. So some of you are probably the same age as your clients, though from the show of hands, maybe not. And, or like me, you currently supervise staff who are the same age as the youth you work with. And that's a good thing. Staff who are of the communities being served are able to connect directly to youth and are invaluable. Hire youth, promote youth into positions of power, real power within your agencies. Smash respectability politics that keep youth out of leadership positions. I know how to do this work. I know how to do it well. I've written national best practices. I've worked directly with city and state entities to shift policies to better meet the needs of runaway, homeless, queer youth. But here's the thing. We, and I very much include myself in this, need to get out of the way and let youth take over. Let youth design their own programs. Let youth run those programs. Let youth tell us who they are and what their identities mean and embrace them. I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time in LGBTQ nonprofits as a consultant and as a visiting artist, and without question, youth workers, all of you across the country, are doing great work with and on behalf of LGBTQ youth every single day. I also think that many of these agencies on other levels are toxic. They're toxic in large part because they mostly unintentionally mirror a police state in the way they structure consequences and are built with a lack of leadership and ownership from youth outside of a few leadership roles which the youth are totally aware are tokenized and artificial. They're really aware. The world outside our agency doors is oppressive and violent and based on power imbalances and punitive responses to conflict and trauma. And so an agency that relies on those same hierarchies is going to be as well. I believe that to create environments that don't burn out our staff and that are actually helping our youth, we need to shift these agencies, these systems entirely. We need to create organizations that are truly youth-led. We can also use our adult privilege to make sure that not only do we get money for our programs to keep them operational, but that we ensure the money is for our programs, not that our programs are for the money. This means it's our job as adults to find money to fund the programs youth know they need, not what researchers or the federal government says they need. The transgender scholar Dean Spade says in his essay, The Nonprofit Industrial Complex and Trans Resistance, he speaks to the shift for LGBTQ organizations away from grassroots localized work into professionalized industry, along with the rise of nonprofit culture since the late 1980s, has led to widespread legal and cultural shifts in the understanding of LGBTQ people. But it's also failed our community's most vulnerable and shifted the ways in which community members interface with LGBTQ organizations. They are too frequently not equal collaborators in fighting against intersectional injustice. Dean says, quote, "This model encourages organizations to identify goals that can be achieved quickly, not to envision the long-term strategies necessary for more radical changes to politics and culture," end quote. We must ensure that youth are given real power within their agencies in order to create the kind of radical changes to policy and culture our world needs. SMIRC, the youth center I grew up at, was youth-founded and youth-run. Youth applied for the grants that started the program, secured fiscal sponsorship for the agency, and learned by trial and error how to run it. Youth were in charge, not in a tokenized way. Youth had real power. There was an advisory board that youth had to apply to be part of and were voted onto by our peers. Being on the advisory board came with a tremendous responsibility. We were literally in charge of the hiring and firing of adult staff. Let me tell you, when adults are literally working for youth, that shifts some power dynamics. I'd like to return to one of the first stories I told about my first conference presentation as the only youth on a panel about embracing youth voices within nonprofits. Let me tell you, the full circle irony of standing here as an adult telling a room predominantly filled with other adults to listen to youth is not lost on me. And 17-year-old me would have been like out those doors 20 minutes ago. Thanks. In closing, I want to encourage us as service providers to ask ourselves what space we are leaving in our programs for youth, not just to design, but literally own those programs. As adults, no matter how well-meaning we are, there are things we can't give to queer youth, things they can only get from one another. Embrace your identities in all of their queer, messy complexity. Tell your story and make space for youth to tell theirs. And when they do, Listen. Listen and believe, and I know this is hard, but step back. As adults, we must let youth lead their own movements. No, we must let youth lead our queer movement. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions up here for Sassafras? She's open to take any questions. We have some microphones floating around here. Oh, we got one over here.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, snap. I'm JC. I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story and being amazing. And I wanted to know if, when I know you're busy, if you would like to come to my campus and speak to our LGBT clubs and students so they know that there is hope out there to achieve any goal and dream they have, because even though I'm motivated, I want to continue helping my community, and that's why I'm here.
Yes, thank you for being here, and I love going to college campuses. Come find me. I'm like sitting over here, and I'll give you like my card, and we can exchange email and all that good jazz. Or you can find me on social media. That's why all those things are.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Yes.
Thank you for
Hi.
sharing. By the way, I'm Daniel. Question, for those of us who are cisgender and are supporting clubs on campus or services on campus, what do you suggest to avoid tokenizing, or, I think a lot of us care, and in that vein, some of us ask, the non-white or LGBTQ youth, educate us. And so I guess my question is twofold. A, what would you recommend in helping to learn? And then B, how do we be a support but not tokenize?
That's a good question. And it's really hard to do when you're wanting to do really good work and you have very limited resources to do it. I mean, I think as much self-education as you can do before you go into conversations with that young person or with that youth leader, awesome. I think also as much as you can create, using your position to create opportunities for young people to get paid for that labor is really important. Whether it's, if your campus or organization is frequently going to the same young person or the same 2 or 3 young people who are amazing. Can you get them paid as interns? Can you get them paid as staff? Even better. But I think as much self-education as you can do, and being really transparent about it with what is going on. They're not unaware that they're being tapped in all of these ways, and so having honest conversations about why that's really helpful to the campus or organization culture, but also recognizing how it's unpaid labor for them.
We have time for one more question right back here.
Great. I'm a queer youth who is in leadership now at a residential treatment facility. Thank you. But I'm just wondering, I'm in a community that's more conservative, and I am in a cis-het relationship right now, so I sort of pass as a straight white dude, but I am trying to support my queer youth there. But I'm wondering, as I rise into leadership, what advice you'd have to start taking those steps, especially in a larger organization that's maybe rooted more in the bureaucracy of it all.
Ooh.
That's a lot.
That's a really big question. Good luck. No, in honesty, I think you're doing it. I think the fact that you're aware of what's going on and you're having, that self-conversation and being here is an amazing first step. And I think, my answer beyond that is sort of twofold, which is push as much as you possibly can in those moments, and also preemptively forgive yourself for your inability to enact massive change alone as a single person within a huge organization. But I would say, keep pushing and figure out who your allies are. And sometimes they come from surprising places, and push them to have dialogues and shift culture. But good luck. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Sassafras. I really appreciate that.